Hello everyone. Today we'll be reading the second part of the chapter, Print Culture and the Modern World. The 19th Century. The 19th century saw vast leaps in mass literacy in Europe, bringing in large numbers of new readers among children, women, and workers. Children, women, and workers. As primary education became compulsory from the late 19th century, children became an important category of readers. Production of school textbooks became critical for the publishing industry. A children's press, devoted to literature for children alone, was set up in France in 1857. This press published new works as well as old fairy tales and folk tales. The Grimm brothers in Germany spent years compiling traditional folk tales gathered from peasants. What they collected was edited before the stories were published in a collection in 1812. Anything that was considered unsuitable for children or would appear vulgar to the elites was not included in the published version. Rural folk tales thus acquired a new form. In this way, print recorded old tales but also changed them. Women became important as readers as well as writers. Penny magazines were especially meant for women, as were manuals teaching proper behavior and housekeeping. When novels began to be written in the 19th century, women were seen as important readers. Some of the best-known novelists were women: Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot. Their writings became important in defining a new type of woman, a person with will, strength of personality, determination, and the power to think. Lending libraries had been in existence from the 17th century onwards. In the 19th century, lending libraries in England became instruments for educating white-collar workers, artisans, and lower middle-class people. Sometimes, self-educated working-class people wrote for themselves. After the working day was gradually shortened from the mid-19th century, workers had some time for self-improvement and self-expression. They wrote political tracts and autobiographies in large numbers. Further innovations. By the late 18th century, the press came to be made out of metal. Through the 19th century, there was a series of further innovations in printing technology. By the mid-19th century, Richard M. Howe of New York had perfected the power-driven cylindrical press. This was capable of printing 8,000 sheets per hour. This press was particularly useful for printing newspapers. In the late 19th century, the offset press was developed, which could print up to 6 colors at a time. From the turn of the 20th century, electrically operated presses accelerated printing operations. A series of other developments followed. Methods of feeding paper improved. The quality of plates became better. Automatic paper reels and photoelectric controls of the color register were introduced. The accumulation of several individual mechanical improvements transformed the appearance of printed texts. Printers and publishers continuously developed new strategies to sell their product. 19th century periodicals serialized important novels, which gave birth to a particular way of writing novels. In the 1920s, in England, popular works were sold in cheap CDs called the shilling CDs. The dust cover or the book jacket is also a 20th century innovation. With the onset of the Great Depression in the 1930s, publishers feared a decline in book purchases. To sustain buying, they brought out cheap paperback editions. India and the world of print. Let us see when printing began in India and how ideas and information were written before the age of print. Manuscripts before the age of print. India had a very rich and old tradition of handwritten manuscripts in Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, as well as in various vernacular languages. Manuscripts were copied on palm leaves or on handmade paper. Pages were sometimes beautifully illustrated. They would be either pressed between wooden covers or sewn together to ensure preservation. Manuscripts continued to be produced till well after the introduction of print, down to the late 19th century. Manuscripts, however, were highly expensive and fragile. They had to be handled carefully, and they could not be read easily as the script was written in different styles. So manuscripts were not widely used in everyday life. Even though pre-colonial Bengal had developed an extensive network of village primary schools, students very often did not read texts. They only learned to write. Teachers dictated portions of text from memory and students wrote them down. Many thus became literate without ever actually reading any kinds of texts. Print comes to India. The printing press first came to Goa with Portuguese missionaries in the mid-16th century. Jesuit priests learned Konkani and printed several tracts. By 1674, about 50 books had been printed in the Konkani and in Kannada languages. Catholic priests printed the first Tamil book in 1579 at Cochin, and in 1713 the first Malayalam book was printed by them. By 1710, Dutch Protestant missionaries had printed 32 Tamil texts, many of them translations of older works. The English language press did not grow in India till quite late, even though the English East India Company began to import presses from the late 17th century. From 1780, James Augustus Hickey began to edit the Bengal Gazette, a weekly magazine that described itself as a commercial paper open to all but influenced by none. So it was a private English enterprise, proud of its independence from colonial influence, that began English printing in India. Hickey published a lot of advertisements, including those that related to the import and sale of slaves. But he also published a lot of gossip about the company's senior officials in India. Enraged by this, the Governor-General Warren Hastings persecuted Hickey and encouraged the publication of officially sanctioned newspapers that could counter the flow of information that damaged the image of the colonial government. By the close of the 18th century, a number of newspapers and journals appeared in print. There were Indians too who began to publish Indian newspapers. The first to appear was the weekly Bengal Gazette, brought out by Gandagar Bhattacharya, who was close to Ram Mohan Roy. Religious reform and public debates. From the early 19th century, as you know, there were intense debates around religious issues. Different groups confronted the changes happening within colonial society in different ways and offered a variety of new interpretations of the beliefs of different religions. Some criticized existing practices and campaigned for reform, while others countered the arguments of reformers. These debates were carried out in public and in print. Printed tracts and newspapers not only spread the new ideas, but they shaped the nature of the debate. A wider public could now participate in these public discussions and express their views. New ideas emerged through these clashes of opinions. This was a time of intense controversies between social and religious reformers and the Hindu orthodoxy over matters like widow immolation, monotheism, Brahmanical priesthood, and idolatry. In Bengal, as the debate developed, tracts and newspapers proliferated, circulating a variety of arguments. To reach a wider audience, the ideas were printed in the everyday spoken language of ordinary people. Ram Mohan Roy published the Sambad Kaumudi from 1821, and the Hindu orthodoxy commissioned the Samachar Chandrika to oppose his opinions. From 1822, two Persian newspapers were published, Jam-e-Jahan Nama and Shamsul Akhbar. In the same year, a Gujarati newspaper, the Bombay Samachar, made its appearance. In North India, the ulama were deeply anxious about the collapse of Muslim dynasties. They feared that colonial rulers would encourage conversion, change the Muslim personal laws. To counter this, they used cheap lithographic presses, published Persian and Urdu translations of holy scriptures, and printed religious newspapers and tracts. The Deoband Seminary, founded in 1867, published thousands upon thousands of fatwas, telling Muslim readers how to conduct themselves in their everyday lives and explaining the meanings of Islamic doctrines. All through the 19th century, a number of Muslim sects and seminaries appeared, each with a different interpretation of faith, each keen on enlarging its following and countering the influence of its opponents. Urdu print helped them conduct these battles in public. Among Hindus, too, print encouraged the reading of religious texts, especially in the vernacular languages. The first printed edition of Ramcharitramanas of Tulsidas, a 16th century text, came out from Calcutta in 1810. By the mid-19th century, cheap lithographic editions flooded North Indian markets. From the 1880s, the Naval Kishore Press at Lucknow and the Sri Venkateshwar Press in Bombay published numerous religious texts in vernaculars. In their printed and portable form, these could be read easily by the faithful at any place and time. They could also be read out to large groups of illiterate men and women. Religious texts therefore reached a very wide circle of people, encouraging discussions, debates, and controversies within and among different religions. Print did not only stimulate the publication of conflicting opinions amongst communities, but it also connected communities and people in different parts of India. Newspapers conveyed news from one place to another, creating pan-Indian identities. New forms of publication. Printing created an appetite for new kinds of writing. As more and more people could now read, they wanted to see their own lives, experiences, emotions, and relationships reflected in what they read. The novel, a literary form which had developed in Europe, ideally catered to this need. It soon acquired distinctively Indian forms and styles. For readers, it opened up new worlds of experience and gave a vivid sense of the diversity of human lives. Other new literary forms also entered the world of reading. Lyrics, short stories, essays about social and political matters. In different ways, they reinforced the new emphasis on human lives and intimate feelings about the political and social rules that shaped such things. By the end of the 19th century, a new visual culture was taking shape. With the setting up of an increasing number of printing presses, visual images could be easily reproduced in multiple copies. Painters like Raja Ravi Verma produced images for mass circulation. Poor wood engravers who made wood blocks set up shop near the letterpresses and were employed by print shops. Cheap prints and calendars, easily available in the bazaar, could be bought even by the poor to decorate the walls of their homes or places of work. These prints began shaping popular ideas about modernity and tradition, religion and politics, and society and culture. By the 1870s, caricatures and cartoons were being published in journals and newspapers, commenting on social and political issues. Some caricatures ridiculed the educated Indians' fascination with Western tastes and clothes, while others expressed the fear of social change. There were imperial caricatures lampooning nationalists as well as nationalist cartoons criticizing imperial rule. Women and print. Lives and feelings of women began to be written in particularly vivid and intense ways. Women's reading therefore increased enormously in middle-class homes. Liberal husbands and fathers began educating their womenfolk at home and sent them to schools when women's schools were set up in the cities and towns after the mid-19th century. Many journals began carrying writings by women and explained why women should be educated. They also carried a syllabus and attached suitable reading matter which could be used for home-based schooling. But not all families were liberal. Conservative Hindus believed that a literate girl would be widowed, and Muslims feared that educated women would be corrupted by reading Urdu romances. Sometimes rebel women defied such prohibition. We know the story of a girl in a conservative Muslim family of North India who secretly learned to read and write in Urdu. Her family wanted her to read only the Arabic Quran, which she did not understand. So she insisted on learning to read a language that was her own. In East Bengal in the early 19th century, Rajsundari Devi, a young married girl in a very orthodox household, learned to read in the secrecy of her kitchen. Later, she wrote her autobiography, Amar Ziban, which was published in 1876. It was the first full-length autobiography published in the Bengali language. Since social reforms and novels had already created a great interest in women's lives and emotions, there was also an interest in what women would have to say about their own lives. From the 1860s, a few Bengali women like Kailash Bashini Devi wrote books highlighting the experiences of women about how women were imprisoned at home, kept in ignorance, forced to do hard domestic labor, and treated unjustly by the very people they served. In the 1880s, in present-day Maharashtra, Tarabai Shinde and Pandita Ramabai wrote with passionate anger about the miserable lives of upper-caste Hindu women, especially widows. A woman in a Tamil novel expressed what reading meant to women who were so greatly confined by social regulations. For various reasons, my world is small. More than half my life's happiness has come from books. While Urdu, Tamil, Bengali and Marathi print culture had developed early, Hindu printing began seriously only from the 1870s. Soon, a large segment of it was devoted to the education of women. In the early 20th century, journals written for and sometimes edited by women became extremely popular. They discussed issues like women's education, widowhood, widow remarriage, and the national movement. Some of them offered household and fashion lessons to women and brought entertainment through short stories and serialized novels. In Punjab too, a similar folk literature was widely printed from the early 20th century. Ram Chadda published the fast-selling Istri Dharm Vichar to teach women how to be obedient wives. The Khalsa Tract Society published cheap booklets with a similar message. Many of these were in the form of dialogues about the qualities of a good woman. In Bengal, an entire area in central Calcutta, the Battala, was devoted to the printing of popular books. Here, you could buy cheap editions of religious tracts and scriptures, as well as literature that was considered obscene and scandalous. By the late 19th century, a lot of these books were being profusely illustrated with woodcuts and colored lithographs. Peddlers took the Batala publications to homes, enabling women to read them in their leisure time. Print and the poor people. Very cheap small books were brought to markets in 19th century Madras towns and sold at crossroads, allowing poor people traveling to markets to buy them. Public libraries were set up from the early 20th century, expanding the access to books. These libraries were located mostly in cities and towns, and at times in prosperous villages. For rich local patrons, setting up a library was a way of acquiring prestige. From the late 19th century, issues of caste discrimination began to be written about in many printed tracts and essays. Jyotiba Phule, the Maratha pioneer of low-caste protest movements, wrote about the injustices of the caste system in his Gulamgiri, 1871. In the 20th century, B.R. Ambedkar in Maharashtra and E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar in Madras, better known as Periyar, wrote powerfully on caste, and their writings were read by people all over India. Local protest movements and sects also created a lot of popular journals and tracts criticizing ancient scriptures and envisioning a new and just future. Workers in factories were too overworked and lacked the education to write much about their experiences. But Kashi Baba, a Kanpur mill worker, wrote and published Chote aur Bade Ka Sawal in 1938 to show the links between caste and class exploitation. The poems of another Kanpur mill worker who wrote under the name of Sudarshan Chakar between 1935 and 1955 were brought together and published in a collection called Sachi Kavitayan. By the 1930s, Bangalore cotton mill workers set up libraries to educate themselves, following the example of Bombay workers. These were sponsored by social reformers who tried to restrict excessive drinking among them, to bring literacy, and sometimes to propagate the message of nationalism. Print and censorship. Before 1798, the colonial state under the East India Company was not too concerned with censorship. Strangely, its early measures to control printed matter were directed against Englishmen in India who were critical of company misrule and hated the actions of particular company officers. The company was worried that such criticisms might be used by its critics in England to attack its trade monopoly in India. By the 1820s, the Calcutta Supreme Court passed certain regulations to control press freedom, and the company began encouraging publication of newspapers that would celebrate British rule. In 1835, faced with urgent petitions by editors of English and vernacular newspapers, Governor-General Bentinck agreed to revise press laws. Thomas Macaulay, a liberal colonial official, formulated new rules that restored the earlier freedoms. After the revolt of 1857, the attitude to freedom of the press changed. Enraged Englishmen demanded a clampdown on the native press. As vernacular newspapers became assertively nationalist, the colonial government began debating measures of stringent control. In 1878, the Vernacular Press Act was passed, modelled on the Irish press laws. It provided the government with extensive rights to censor reports and editorials in the vernacular press. From now on, the government kept regular track of the vernacular newspapers published in different provinces. When a report was judged as seditious, the newspaper was warned, and if the warning was ignored, the press was liable to be seized and the printing machinery confiscated. Despite repressive measures, nationalist newspapers grew in numbers in all parts of India. They reported on colonial misrule and encouraged nationalist activities. Attempts to throttle nationalist criticism provoked militant protest. This in turn led to a renewed cycle of persecution and protests. When Punjab revolutionaries were deported in 1907, Bal Gangadhar Tilak wrote with great sympathy about them in his Kesari. This led to his imprisonment in 1908, provoking in turn widespread protests all over India. And that is the end of this chapter. We will be reading the other textbooks in the upcoming videos. Until then, stay tuned.